Canada still like clings to this illusion of monarchy because it's easier than facing the contradictions of the state we actually built. Because while we call ourselves democratic, we still keep this hereditary sovereign as the head of state. We say we're post-colonial, but we preserve the exact institution that's required to conquer and divide and subjugate land to absolute power like a king. So every year, Canada pretends to be a democracy. And then every few years, the monarchy shows up just to remind everyone that it isn't. And so here, King Charles in the Senate, a man nobody is elected, a man whose qualifications for the job is that his mom wore a crown and died in 2022. He's met with this cordial response, cameras, like the whole nine yards, the MPs being the commoners being brought in to be able to like be in the presence of the king. They have to be escorted by a guard. And it just like forces so much hierarchy. It's so much class division. That's why the Bloc Quebecois isn't there. And that absence says more than anything all of this performative standing can do combined. Because while the rest of Canada tries to convince itself that the monarchy is just a harmless tradition, at least Quebec has the political memory to recognize it for what it is, and that is a foreign colonial institution imposed at gunpoint. It's still venerated like it owns the palace, because technically, obviously, it does. And to walk through the history, the British monarchy doesn't show up with peacekeeping. It shows up in 1759 at the Plains of Abraham with artillery. Quebec wasn't invited into some grand family of nations. It was conquered, annexed, and subjected. The crown became a legal instrument of assimilation. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 carved up Indigenous lands without consent. And then a half century later, the Durham Report, after Quebec rose up in the 1837 Patriot Rebellion, prescribed a nice dose of cultural assimilation to the French. And as Lord Durham said, make them English. And this isn't a neutral constitutional framework. This is a colonial management dressed in these powdered wigs and these nice robes. It still imposes British rule, being subjected to the crown and cross that is the British monarchy. 200 years later, we're still supposed to believe that the monarchy is just symbolic. And if it's symbolic, then symbolic of what and symbolic of who? Because if you look in Quebec, by the 1960s, Quebec had enough. The Quiet Revolution kicked the church, the Catholic Church, out of public life. It built secular institutions, nationalized its hydro sector, and started acting like a modern nation. The slogan was maîtrise chez nous, masters in our own house. And you can't be masters of your own house while pledging loyalty to a monarch overseas who's never set foot on your street. And so the crown became obsolete in Quebec, not just politically, but culturally. It was a foreign relic of domination. They didn't just feel that way, they acted on it. In just 3 years ago, in 2022, Quebec's National Assembly passed Bill 4, which removed the requirement for elected officials to swear loyalty to the king. From now on, members of the National Assembly swear allegiance to the people of Quebec, not to a monarchy, not to a foreign dynasty, not to an empire, to the people of Quebec. Imagine that, to the people. So when King Charles shows up to address the people, the commoners, and the Senate, the Bloc will not be there. They say, nope, no thanks. And it's not because they're being rude, it's because they're being consistent to the overall politics of the populace. Only 14% of Quebecers want the monarchy to stick around for generations to come. That's not a protest vote, that's a cultural consensus. And the Bloc Québécois' absence reflects that. It's not a tantrum, it's a rejection of the whole ridiculous premise that an unelected hereditary sovereign should open a democratic legislature in 2025. And that's the thing, like, make no mistake, this visit isn't just about tradition, it's about optics. It's so much about optics. Carney invited King Charles during this standoff that Canada is having with the US, and it's not protocol. This is just literally colonial mythology modernized. Look at us. we're stable, we're dignified, still not like those Americans. Like they have turned the monarch in this process into a legitimate PR stunt and like an element of statecraft, as always with the Carney regime. And so the Bloc said, no, we're not taking part in this. And I say, good, they shouldn't, not even as a supporter of the Bloc, but as a supporter of these politics. This isn't something that's just across all Quebec. It's across most of Canada. The Crown has been less popular now than ever. There was an Angus Reid poll that said only 30% of Canadians want to keep the monarchy going indefinitely. Nearly half, 46% want it gone. The kicker, though, is that and it's such a, microcosm of the Canadian political system. 24% say they don't care either way. And like everything in Canadian politics, it's that apathy that props this whole system up. People don't support the monarchy. They're just too tired or too cynical, or they just don't care. They don't bother to do or think about it in any way. And the system, the whole structure is built to exploit that, because getting rid of the monarchy in Canada isn't just a simple vote. It requires a constitutional amendment under Section 41. That means approval from the House of Commons, the Senate, and all 10 provincial legislators. And so one veto, the monarchy stays. And so the result of that is that no one tries, because it's politically radioactive. So we keep drifting through this system where even if a majority of people oppose this, it survives through this institutional inertia and these colonial underpinnings and of these ceremonies and rituals. And essentially, what is constitutional cowardice? I'm going to clip this into a video, and there'll be people asking, like, why do you care? The monarchy is just symbolic. And first of all, that's just not true. The monarchy has real reserve powers. In Australia, it's been used in 1975. The Governor General, which is like the representative of the Queen, and the same thing here, fired a sitting prime minister. In 2008, Stephen Harper asked the Governor General to prorogue Parliament and dodge a non-confidence vote. I mean, Trudeau did something similar, but that was essentially because he needed to resign, so it's not really the same thing. Boris Johnson, though, did the exact same thing. Like, it's literally used as a negotiating point within the political system. And if it wasn't there, there would be more representation of the people rather than these leaders being able to pull these prorogue moves to cop out and have political survival, at least for themselves or their party. And the other thing is that even if it doesn't act directly, and this is the part that I have the biggest objection to, is that this entire thing just legitimizes systemic inequality. Like, it tells us that power can be inherited, that one family is inherently more worthy of reverence than others, and that this hierarchy is natural within the Canadian state. It is what Foucault called capillary power, because it's not just of force, it's of ritual. It's baked into the schools, the courts, the currency. Like, for the longest time, right, like our parents' generation, up until Canada, saying God save the Queen or God save the King, this ceremony is occurring. Like everything else, people suffering under poverty and colonial violence watch these leaders dress up for a man in gold braid. And I don't think that's harmless. I think that's like all statecraft. It's ideological training, because the crown acts as like a colonial smokescreen. And this is especially prevalent among Indigenous peoples. Like, we're told the monarchy is essentially like a core element of Canada because Indigenous treaties were signed with the crown. But if you look at it for even just a second, logically, the reason is to keep the monarchy, or a reason to finally face this unfinished colonial project, which is them to not recognize the treaties and to just move forward in a way that says those aren't a thing, the new white paper or whatever, because those treaties are still not being honored. And there's like multiple aspects of the Canadian state that is overriding them in a way that's unprecedented currently. And it's never been resolved, right? Land stolen, resources extracted, nations starved, abused, sterilized, removed from their land, put on reserves. If their land was kept, it's been destroyed by resource extraction. And so, like, if the crown still matters in these types of relationships, then it's not just symbolic. It's the mechanism through which Canada evades its responsibilities. Like, if you want reconciliation, then get rid of the crown. not as a gesture, but as the first step toward equal nation to nation relationships. Treat other nations in this land like actual peers, not like they're subject to British legal traditions without their consent. And there is an alternative to this, and the alternative is that instead of a monarchy, we could have a head of state who's actually accountable to the people, like how they have in Ireland, where they have the Taoiseach, which is the prime minister, and then they have a president. And so you can have an elected head of state that is a symbolic figure. That is what, like in France, that figure has much more power and is like more like the US. But like in Ireland, Ireland has it where it's like the president is very much just a head of state. They're a head of state diplomat that is elected by a consensus of the elected body, which then makes it like it's a consensus either way. It needs to be someone who can consolidate many political sides within the system, which that's democracy, not this absolute power. And that's the thing too, is that if they are shitty, if they're involved in awful things like pedophilia or hoarding of wealth in extravagant ways or just many awful things, they can be removed from their position. Instead, we get these parasitic freaks sitting on the throne. And the alternative is that instead of having this like royal pageantry, you would have a civic ceremonies, like a civic ceremony that honored workers, survivors, artists, elders, cultural figures. Instead of hiding behind like the crown in treaty negotiations, it could be nations to nations, right? Facing Indigenous peoples with honesty, responsibility, and respect. That's what the Canadian state can do rather than with the crown. Because with the crown gives it an element of it's not nations to nations. They're subject to that power. And to remove that obviously takes a lot of political effort. It takes a lot of political will. And most of our political class would rather stay loyal subjects than admit that this whole system is completely redundant. And so the bottom line is that Quebec and the Bloc Québécois is not being difficult by not being a part of this. They're just being honest with the people of Quebec, because the monarchy doesn't represent Quebec. It never did. It represents the colonial conquest of it, the forced assimilation of the French, of Indigenous peoples. Not at all in the same way, but the crown represents that. It is the hereditary privilege that creates this hierarchy system between all of these different classes of people. And it's also like the material force that creates the divide within class, right? Like how the crown has a deal through the band system with some nations that are closely connected to the Canadian state. And in working with them, they help fuck over lesser First Nations. Lesser as in like not connected through the band system, and they're being overridden by like the hereditary, like their hereditary system is being overridden by the band system because of the band system being in like directly with the crown, which then overrides the entire thing. If they're supposed to be able to have their like traditional laws and traditional legal systems, by having the crown, you nullify that. And so when the Bloc Québécois refuses to be at this colonial ceremony in the King Charles throne speech, it's not because they're being rude or like pedantic. It's because they're pointing out that what the rest of these people here are pretending not to see, either because of their own political survival, or because they truly believe in it, or because they believe in like the tradition of Canada. And like the thing that people are, yeah, I mean, they'll probably talk about it. I mean, they might even not. They might just glance over it. It's definitely not something that you would see. Like it's probably on Radio Canada, but it's definitely not on any other Quebec media as far as like being shown live. It's going to be like commented on, but it's not necessarily in any way like you won't see it on TVA or anything. But yeah, it's just that they're rejecting that Canada still like clings to this illusion of monarchy because it's easier than facing the contradictions of the state we actually built. Because while we call ourselves democratic, we still keep this hereditary sovereign as the head of state. We say we're post-colonial, but we preserve the exact institution that's required to conquer and divide and subjugate land to absolute power like a king. And it's just such a deep contradiction. Like we teach children, we teach in political science, like the understanding of like equality is a good thing, while stamping the king's face on our money or the Queen's face on our money. And so the Bloc's absence is the most honest part of the entire ceremony, because again, until Canada can actually reconcile this contradiction of democracy over pageantry, accountability over ancestry, and truth over like a need to subscribe and subject to tradition, the monarchy will always be more than symbolic, despite what they say. It will always act as a mirror, one that shows us exactly who holds power in Canada and who is expected to be subjected to it. That's what this is. That's what this entire thing is. Plain and simple.